Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Give everyone a few more minutes to join. Thanks. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Excited to see some familiar names on the participant list. I'm so excited about this webinar because I'm joined by Rena Shah and Nathaniel Norton, uh, very old friends. I mean, not old, but longtime friends who've been doing this work with me. And it's just wonderful to come back together and talk about this handbook and right to counsel. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of information. Then we're going to introduce ourselves, but this webinar has been approved for Missouri CLE credits. You can see the program ID there. If you have questions about other states, send me an email and we can talk. But I know in Missouri, we have a pretty lax CLE approval. Like it's not a complicated system, and sometimes it's hard to port to other places, but we can talk about it. We are recording, and so just something to be aware of, but also that means I will be sharing the recording. I'm going to put it up on YouTube, just like I did the February webinar. But any questions you're asking or chat is also being recorded. Just wanted to let you know. But yeah, I think that's it. We also have a cart captioning. If you have questions about that, please put them in the chat, but you should be able to turn them on at the bottom in your panel, your dashboard. Um, yeah. So in terms of what's going to happen, oh yeah, please, if you haven't already, pull up the handbook, the version that's in the Google Drive. That QR code will take you to the Google Drive that has has the handbook in full version, but also section by section. It also has links to PowerPoint I'm using today and the recording of the webinar from February. This recording, a link will also go in that Google Drive. I suggest that in terms of using this handbook, going forward, that you, instead of downloading it and putting it somewhere on your hard drive or in the cloud, somewhere on your cloud, right, that you just access it in this Google Drive, because we're constantly making updates. I've made updates since February. There'll be more happening. So one thing I've done is created a shortcut to the handbook that's on my desktop. So if you're in Google Chrome, if you go to the three little dots at the top right, you can create a shortcut to a Google Drive, to a web page on your desktop. So I've done that, so make it easy to access all the time. But because we're updating it so often, it will quickly become out of date if you've downloaded it. So that's my suggestion. Okay, so what's going to happen? Introductions, overview. I'm going to provide an overview of the Right to Counsel section. Then Rena will discuss the National Joint Legal Aid Coalition work that she led on this topic. And Nathaniel's going to discuss his advocacy before the United Nations. I'm also going to field a few questions to them, and there'll be time for questions at the end. If something's going on, you have questions, feel free to interrupt us, put some questions in the chat. I'm happy. Oh yeah, so if the link is going to the webinar, I'll put it in the chat again. But it should be going, if you just look in the Google Drive, you should be able to see there's various folders, but the PDFs that are in the Google Drive are for the handbook. So let me introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to Rena and then Nathaniel to introduce themselves. I'm a professor at St. Louis University School of Law. I run a human rights at home clinic. Been involved in this handbook since since we first created it back in 2012. It was a long time. I was working then at American University, Washington College of Law, running a local human rights lawyering project. Since then, I've been teaching full time and just updated this handbook, and I'll talk about that going forward. So Rena, you're up next. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I'll just start off by saying that we love Lauren. Lauren is amazing. She put together this handbook and then she updated this handbook, which is like a huge feat. So thank you, Lauren, for keeping up with this work. So I'm Rena Shaw. I'm the executive director of the Maryland Access to Justice Commission. And I actually worked with Lauren when out of American University, Maryland Legal Aid received a grant as part of this project. And we were one of two. And at that time, I got promoted from being a housing attorney to being the director of the Human Rights Project at Maryland Legal Aid, where we were trying to implement human rights laws and norms into our domestic advocacy.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Norton. I'm a staff attorney with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. I work remotely, but I'm sort of office out of San Antonio. Um, I was a farm worker attorney for quite a while, and originally at TRLA, and then at Maryland Legal Aid. When this project started, the local human rights lawyering project started. TRLA was the other grantee. And yeah, I worked with Rena and Lauren on this, and now I don't really do much farm work or any farm worker law anymore. I do consumer law somehow and collections. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rena. Thank you, Nathaniel. It's so wonderful to have the gang all back together. And thank you for taking time to do this today. I think it's important to try and keep this momentum going since we've released this new version. So speaking of this handbook, so just to give you an idea, I'm not going to go through the whole handbook today. There's no way, we don't have time. But I'll give you sort of some backgrounds on the handbook, and I'm going to do a deep dive into section 5.13, which is the right to counsel section as an example. But there's hopefully going to be more webinars. And I did do in February a webinar on sort of an overview, some general ideas of how to use the handbook. So take a look at that if you're interested. So the handbook, we originally released a version in 2013. It was last updated in 2015. And the idea was to help integrate human rights into the everyday work of public interest attorneys here in the US, right? Really big, bold goal. But we were specifically looking at integrating human rights, international human rights, into legal arguments before courts and policymakers, right? We thought, okay, we have an army of legal aid attorneys, of public defenders out in local courts, state courts, federal courts every day, right? And if we can have these attorneys using human rights, right, it's sort of a grassroots approach, right? The human rights law is going to trickle up into appellate courts, et cetera. And so that's, still a major focus of the handbook is integrating human rights into legal arguments. But we also have chapters on integrating human rights into client-staff relationships, office systems, and also looking at international human rights advocacy, right? Advocacy before the United Nations or before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And there's lots of complaints, shadow reports linked throughout this handbook, including in section 5.13 on the right to counsel. So not just looking at integrating human rights into court and policy work, but also as an additional tool, international human rights advocacy, which we're going to Rena and Nate are also going to talk about today. So different ways of using human rights in public interest work. And I will just say, when we first started this project, we focused on legal aid attorneys. And so we were looking at civil, that was our focus, but we've since expanded and we're really trying to expand even more and working on several criminal law focused chapters. I will say that as a caveat right now, it's still, the handbook tends to be still civil focused, but really trying to expand in that direction soon. So more to come is what I'm trying to say. So made a bunch of updates over the last few years to the handbook, finally released it this January. There are new sections, one on water and sanitation, one on right to privacy, one on rights of Indigenous persons, another on human rights defenders. So really excited about that. We also updated all the individual sections. So there's new definitions, trying to expand and keep up with all the international human rights definitions, the right to housing, right to healthy environment. Those have really sort of flourished. Even the right to counsel in the last 10 years have flourished and changed and the definitions have gotten more substantive. Data is updated, case law, case studies, more links to briefs, complaints, shadow reports, all of that we tried to do as much as possible to things that have happened in the last few years, as well as things that happened 10, 15 years ago. The new handbook is now available online. When we first published it, we literally handed out paper copies. We also handed out, distributed PDFs. But now that this is a 400-page document, this is a little unwieldy. So available online, available section by section. And again, we're going to keep updating it. So hopefully it won't get so out of date quickly. This was not possible. This update was not possible without lots of students, some of which are on this webinar today. Thank you for helping with all this research and writing. So it was not just my law students at St. Louis, but also at American University, Northeastern, Santa Clara, University of Illinois, Chicago School of Law, and UMass Law. So, dozens of folks over a few years, and also all of the faculty who were supervising those students. It was a big project, and so grateful to you all for getting involved. So, turning to section 5.13 in particular. So, table of contents should be navigable. If you click on, say, chapter 2 in the table of contents, it's going to take you to the Google Drive to chapter 2, that section. That's sort of how I decided to make it navigable. But, lots of other things happening in this handbook, but today we're looking at right to counsel. So chapter 5, section 5.13. There are now 17 sections in chapter 5, which is amazing. So right to counsel, again, this right to counsel is focused on civil cases for indigent clients, right? There's not going to be as much for you if you're working in criminal law yet, but it's been 60 plus years since Gideon v. Wainwright, right? And so we have a picture of Clarence Earl Gideon, but also my colleague, Professor Catherine Banks. We rescued a kitten from our law school parking garage named Gideon, and so that's Gideon the kitty. We call him Giddy the kitty. I had to put a picture of him in there because he is our clinic mascot, and adorable. But anyways, right, 60 plus years since Gideon v. Wainwright, lots of still remaining issues on the criminal side, but even more on the civil side, right? And we're so behind when we look at the rest of the world, right? So the EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Madagascar, South Africa ensure free legal aid for indigent people. UK has guaranteed the right to counsel in civil cases for 5 centuries, right? Our right to counsel is so limited, and so much more needs to be done. Now, since we first published this handbook in the last 10 years, a lot has happened. And that's very exciting, at the local level, right? At the state level, local level in particular. So that's exciting, but still a lot more needs to be done. And we are going to talk about this specifically in the context of migrant farm workers. Rena and Nate will discuss this work, and I think a lot of the exciting things that happen in terms of right to counsel for migrant farm workers, started and continued to flourish because of this coalition work. So really important development. Okay, so overview of chapter 5, right? In chapter 5, all the sections have the same layout, right? They start with an introduction that has a definition of that right or the rights associated with that issue. Then we go into statistics and data. Then we go into relevant human rights law. Then we have sample arguments, right? Talking points that relate to those sample arguments, case studies, and then we have links to briefs and petitions, and then an other resources section, which is sort of like anything from reports to law review articles to anything sort of relevant that doesn't fit in one of those other sections. We sort of added into other resources. So right to counsel, right? Um, Section 5.13.3 is the human rights law. And we start with ratified human rights instruments, which usually means treaties. And in the handbook, if you see a little flag next to the treaty, you know that it's a ratified treaty, which matters matters in terms of what it, well, it matters in a variety of different ways, but I guess it's a stronger source of law to cite to. It doesn't mean we still have a right of action under a ratified treaty, but means a little bit more. It means that we have a duty not to violate the treaty. And so it starts with ratified treaties, then we go into other sorts of human rights instruments after that. We've put as much as we can what could be relevant to this right. And some rights, like right to counsel, there's all sorts of different kinds of instruments that might be relevant. Hold on, I think did I see a hand? Well, okay. If you have a hand, or feel free to put a question in the chat if you need me to pause and explain something. Again, because of timing today, don't have time to go through all of how to use human rights law in the United States in state courts and federal courts, but happy to do more trainings on that. I want to make sure that we have time to talk with Rena and Nate today too. So after we get into the relevant law, the relevant human rights law, right, treaties, human rights instruments, we look at case law, not just case law from European Court of Human Rights or international case law, but also look at U.S. cases where international human rights have come into play, right? And we're also looking at local statute, local ordinances, local code, state code related to that right. And I know for a fact that we're missing some key things in our U.S. statutes right to counsel section. If you have from your state any updates, please send them to me. You can email or at the end of each chapter, at the end of each section in chapter 5, there's a link that brings you to a form to make suggestions or additions, and that's where some of our updates are coming from. Please send me if you know of local ordinances that we've missed. We would love to add them in. Then we get into sample arguments. So the idea here was you are a busy public interest attorney. You don't have time to write up arguments, do the legal research. The idea is this could be cut and paste into a brief, into a complaint, into your draft of your talking points to the state legislator, right? And we are not, the idea is we want this to be cut and pastable. So please copy our arguments. You can obviously do your own research, write your own arguments. But we're not, these are samples, but also we're going to encourage you to use them. So we have the sample argument and then talking points, right? And the idea was you could print these out, take them to court with you, print these out, take them to your talk with city council, right? And again, use these are for you to use. You can use them word for word. Then we have sample briefs and petitions. You can see there's other things in here like an opinion, comments, right? Shadow reports, right? So for each section, including this right to counsel section, we tried to include civil society submissions to treaty bodies or to the Human Rights Council during the Universal Periodic Review process. So it's essentially a report that's a shadow report is a report that's telling the treaty body or the Human Rights Council what the U.S.'s record is on this particular right. And so the U.S. submits its official report to the UN Human Rights Mechanism, whether it's the UN Human Rights Council or the treaty body. But civil society can also submit a shadow report. Like, here's what's really going on. The U.S. report is going to be, we're so great. This is all the things that we're doing, right? And civil society, whoever it is, right, can be academics, nonprofits. We also have lots of tribal groups that are submitting information. If there is a human rights institute or commission, and other countries have national human rights institutes, so it's a little different, but it can be an individual can also submit a shadow report. So here's one from 2014, a little while ago, but on the right to meaningful access to counsel in civil cases, really on point. This issue, I think probably, if maybe some of you on this webinar know, has come up, I think, in pieces and parts in other shadow reports, but this is the last one we could find that was just focused completely on this issue. And then case examples, case studies. So this case was brought by Maryland Legal Aid. Many of you on this webinar work currently at Maryland Legal Aid, so you probably know this case intimately. But this is an example, a great example of using human rights documents, human rights reports, right? Instead of trying to hold the court to procedure or to case law or to some provision of a treaty, right? This was a great example of using the international human rights advocacy that was done by the National Legal Aid Coalition for Farm Worker Right to Access, using that advocacy and the reports and the things that came out of that advocacy in a court case. So just briefly, this is a case out of Maryland, out of I think what county was it, guys? I'm forgetting, but
Montgomery County.
Montgomery County. Thank you. I was like, can't even remember right now. So a attorney from Maryland Legal Aid, and it was a legal intern. I think it was so not a law student. We're trying to visit a client who lived and worked, who was a migrant farm worker, lived and worked on a farm in Montgomery County. And when they went to go visit their client, they were the farmer, the owner of the farm, called the police. The police came and issued trespass citations against the attorney and the legal intern. And so this was a case brought by Maryland Legal Aid against the farm and against Montgomery County regarding this issue of right to counsel and legal access. So the Montgomery County, in the meantime, dismissed the trespass citations and said, responded to the Maryland Legal Aid's complaint and said that the case was now moot. The trespass citations have been dismissed, and therefore the case is moot. So because of all of the work that Maryland Legal Aid and this National Coalition had done, they were able to point to not only that this happened in other cases in Maryland, right, to fight this this motion to dismiss, they were able to say that these kind of abuses, this problem of not access to counsel, not just access to counsel, but access for healthcare organizations and others, right? That they've petitioned human rights officials, that this coalition of legal aid groups across the country have petitioned human rights officials um, for the investigation of this, right? And cited to the complaints and the reports. And then also, oops, I guess they didn't put it in here. There was also a special rapporteur letter that went out. So the UN also responded and had some advice, right, for this national group. And so they were able to say this is an ongoing problem. This is not moot. This is happening, not just, it's going to keep happening here in Maryland. It's going to keep happening across the country, right? And survive the motion to dismiss. So I think really interesting, important way to integrate human rights, international human rights advocacy before the United Nations and other groups into a local case, right? A case about a local issue. And I so love the way this was done. There's lots of challenges to integrating human rights into state and federal cases, but this is a great way of doing it. I wrote an entire article sort of giving you advice about how best to try and integrate human rights law into complaints, into local cases. One example is the Rivero case, right? But there's lots of other examples. I focused three. One was a criminal case. One was a landlord-tenant case, the Bellinger case out of Maine, and then this Rivero case from Maryland, right? So the idea is really to first know your judge, know use this as a cherry on the top, right? You're going to make strong arguments in local law, state law, national law, and then top it off with a human rights perspective, like as the cherry on the top, or use human rights reports like they did in the Rivero case, or use human rights language, right, to start off. These are all really good ways of, in your court that you practice in all the time in your division, trying some of this out. So take a look at that article for more detailed information, more advice about specifically using human rights in court cases. So I also want to make sure to mention international advocacy, right? I've been talking about that, we're going to keep talking about that in terms of what we did with the National Legal Aid Coalition for farm workers' rights, right? But what are some opportunities right now, and what are some ways to start getting involved? So the U.S. is being reviewed by the UN Human Rights Council through the Universal Periodic Review this November. The U.S. was set to be reviewed last year. The U.S. said they were not going to participate, which is, there's a first time for everything, and that was the first time for the Universal Periodic Review process. There's another example of another country that initially refused, but we'll see what happens this fall. But there is an ongoing process. There are going to be lots of ways to get involved in side events, which are events usually organized by nonprofit civil society, are both in Geneva but across the United States regarding this Universal Periodic Review process that's happening this year. If you're interested in getting involved, that email address, upr@aclu.org, it's the email address for the group of organizations, a group of people who are working on the Universal Periodic Review. It happens to be hosted by UCL or by ACLU, but it's just because they volunteered to have the listserv, not because they own this coalition or anything like that. But email and say you'd like to get involved. There's a whole lot of information and great people that we can link you to. You can also email me if you'd rather do that. We can talk about it. But that's ongoing. There's always opportunities to bring complaints and bring issues to UN special rapporteurs. And there's, a section of the handbook about how to do that. But if you want to partner with a clinic, right, there's lots of law clinics at law schools that do that kind of work and can give advice on that. Same with treaty body reviews. So, the U.S. Periodically, every human rights treaty that it has ratified will go before that treaty body and talk about compliance with the treaty. The one that's pending right now is the Convention Against Torture. The Committee Against Torture will review the U.S. at some point soon, and then the other ones will happen later. But so there's, I'm just sort of giving you examples of things to get involved in and ways to get involved. Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, you can submit requests for thematic hearings and petitions. Again, lots of law clinics that will partner with public interest groups and in directly impacted persons to do that. And then please join the Bringing Human Rights Home listserv. There is a Bringing Human Rights Home network of lawyers from across the U.S. There's over 800 lawyers who are in the network who are interested in using human rights in courts and before policymakers, and also doing international human rights advocacy. There's an annual CLE. It just happened a few weeks ago it was in Philadelphia, but it happens every year in June. And there's lots of other great things that go by on the listserv for you to get involved in. So I encourage you to do that if you're interested in that as well. Okay, so we talked a lot. I'm gonna turn it over to Rena to specifically talk about the National Joint Legal Aid Coalition work. And again, thank you so much, Rena, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lauren, for all of that. This was a while back that Nate and I were working on these things at Maryland Legal Aid. But essentially, how this sort of complaint to the special rapporteur of extreme poverty and human rights came about is, Nate and I worked down the hall from each other. And at some point, I'm sure, because he was a farm worker attorney, we were talking about sort of the plight of farm workers, and something that I was just understanding. Well, it does make a lot of sense when, you realize that farm workers are living in these rural, isolated sort of farms, and, they're housed where their employers are. And so, they sort of, the employers have so much power and control over the lives of farm workers. And, when it was brought to light, sort of, there's a lot of abuses, obviously, that happen to farm workers. They're working out in the heat. There's a lot of sort of health provisions and other code violations that could be happening. And when they cannot even when farm workers try to go and meet with them to talk to them about their rights, they can't even get on these properties because they're deemed to be trespassers. That was very compelling, and kind of looking at, human rights language, and, the treaties, and really thinking about the ICCPR, access to sort of a remedy, and also the treaty in regards to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the fact that most farm workers, are immigrants or of different racial minorities and ethnicities. When we started putting all of these together, for Maryland and sort of the farm workers there, obviously, as Lauren said, obviously Nate has this connection. He had this connection with this whole community of farm worker attorneys across the country. And it was something that was common, and something that traversed all of the states, that it was a common issue. And so we started to organize and bring all of those advocates together, and really kind of document. I mean, it was a big exercise in documentation. We had regular meetings, and we asked people from all over the US, in different states, to write down their stories, and send it to us for the purpose of filing this complaint, and kind of nail down the exact sort of international treaties that we would cite. But it was a very now looking back on it, it seemed like just the natural thing to do, because there were all of these patchy protections, different laws, in terms of, state protections. And so the human rights frame was really sort of the one that we could kind of bring all of these things under one umbrella, and seeing that, farm workers really didn't have any voice at all, um, in this space. That was the path that we chose. And I think we put together the first maybe of its kind complaint to the special rapporteur. And it was not something that we know, for example, we knew that what could come of it. Some of the things with human rights, and when we were working on this, like, how do we bring it into domestic advocacy? One part is, it might not necessarily get you like the relief that you're seeking, like you do in the local courts. Although, in the criminal side, there is good evidence of how the human rights frame and law was able to turn some of these Supreme Court cases in terms of juvenile, um, uh, you know, um, detainment and things like that. But I think what we honestly felt is that the frame is really important, to look at people and humans and human dignity, and say that there is some mechanism where these people could tell their stories, that we could document this. There are sort of principles and laws out there that say that people should not be treated this way, and that we could document it and bring it to a forum for people to have a way to voice, the inhumanity that was happening. And oh my God, I've been like getting emotional, but that's essentially what we were trying to do, and use these different kind of methods to do it. I will say, in terms of this, I think the power in using human rights really does come from this reframing. And to me, it's very present now as we think about everything that's happening, the rhetoric around, oh my gosh, around immigration, around the dehumanizing of immigrants. Sorry, I have no idea where this is coming from. But I think that's where the power lies. So the first thing, as an attorney, having been someone who was responsible at Maryland Legal Aid, to not only how can we bring it into our domestic advocacy, but how do we bring it into our organization? How do we bring it to the people who work there to convince them that this is an important thing? The starting point was really the frame, and really thinking about human dignity differently, and looking at these issues in a different way. So, in terms of even thinking about the frame of how things are talked about, how immigrants are talked about, you switch it from these people are intruders or threats or they're in economic drain to this is a person who possesses inherent rights and dignity and they're seeking a better life, right? So like I think that framing is the key component. As an attorney, you have to start there. You have to start with how are you looking at how are we used, how is the mass sort of media telling us to look at people? How are the leaders right now communicating how people should be looked at and what they deserve? The law is like, this is what you're deserving of, but human rights tells you we have something higher to be able to say that this is what we can be looking at, even if it doesn't exist in sort of present local or state or federal law. So I would say that's a starting point. And so, in terms of the work and how it has continued for me personally in Maryland, Maryland was only the second state in the whole country to pass a statewide right to counsel in evictions law. And, we're very proud of that. And I will, say again that, the power of human rights comes first from this reframing in the housing context, similar to the immigration context. Housing is generally looked at as a commodity, as a investment vehicle. So if you can't afford it, too bad, you're out in rent court. They're just in terms of it's a moral failing for the tenant not to be able to afford housing, or it's about the landlord's rights. Like we have personal property and so we need to get paid for it. Versus really one changing the frame to really think of it as a social good. It's something that's a fundamental human right. A person, a human being is entitled to safety, security, and a place to exist. And it's not a personal failure. If a person just doesn't get paid enough, there's a systemic failure. If they're working three jobs and they still don't get paid enough to meet their basic human needs, like we're going to penalize that person rather than addressing the systemic issues. And so one, it starts there. And I think I used to be a Peace Corps volunteer and I was overseas always talking about human rights to people in sort of Nepal. That's where I was. And so human rights was always something, one, that was for other people and not people here. But two, when I talk to people in villages in Nepal about their human rights, there's an empowerment that comes from there. And I think the same thing has happened with the human right to housing movement in the States. It's nascent, but at least a couple of decades old now. And I think the power really has come from people really saying that I have a right to housing and using those things to move policy. And the way that we were able to get a human right to housing, a right to housing in Maryland, and access to counsel is because there was a partnership between sort of the grassroots human rights movement and also, sort of a way to codify that into law. I will just read to you in terms of where our law actually ended up, but it highlights how we tried to use human rights. We weren't necessarily successful in getting that language that we wanted. But in sort of the preamble of the law that was passed that has a right to counsel, we put, whereas providing a right to counsel to tenants in eviction cases is proven means of preventing the disruptive displacement of families and the resulting social, economic, and public health costs of such displacement, we also had other human rights provisions in the preamble. That was unfortunately struck. And the language of providing a right to counsel was changed to access to counsel. But what wasn't changed is the word shall, in terms of they shall have a right. They shall have access to counsel. And so we do still interpret it as a right to access counsel. It's a little bit whatever, but we're still able now have a program that serves many more people because of that framing, because of the advocacy using that right, because people, spoke up and there's a movement for human rights to be able to say this is important. So I think it all works together. Start with the reframing, look at that language. Even if you can't cite it in your cases, you can use the language without citing it. You can reframe things. And then slowly, as we saw in this Navarro case, it's really interesting how something that we did to be able to provide a forum for people to speak and just say these are the issues that we are facing, then came back and said, had an impact on domestic law. So that was a really great sort of full circle. Let me stop there, but that's how I think the domestic application would be most potent and powerful.
Thank you, Rena. Love it, love it. And yeah, it brings me it's a lot. It's very emotional to talk about these things, and I appreciate your emotions for it. Um, okay, Nate, I'm gonna turn it over to you if you want to sort of tell me a little bit about what what you remember about the international work that you did, but I'm also curious about, and Rena, you could weigh in here about, what do you think the long-term impacts were of the international advocacy? What were sort of some of the lessons learned and challenges going forward? If you want to talk about that, but thanks, Nate.
Okay. Yeah, I will. I'll try to remember, and I may get stuff wrong because it's all pretty hazy, but I'll get you'll get the thread. So I think after we submitted the complaint to the special rapporteur, my recollection is that we waited a while and were very surprised to get a response. And we got a response from three different special rapporteurs writing together. And then got a response from the US government. And then I think that sort of led us to think, oh, we should keep pushing this issue because it's got some traction and the special rapporteurs seem interested. Um, and, shortly after that, it was the time when the US was going to be up for review under the ICCPR and then the CERD and then the Universal Periodic Review. And so I think we sort of planned we're going to use this coalition and sort of participate in all these processes, or at least we started to decided to participate in the ICCPR then. And so the ICCPR review is done before the Human Rights Committee, right? Which is the members of that committee are not, politicians employed by the governments. They're sort of independent human rights experts from different countries. And the U.S. would be, so submits a report to the committee saying, here's how we as the U.S. are abiding by our obligations under the ICCPR, and then we, and many other people around the country submitted shadow reports on different issues saying, well, actually, here's where you're falling short with regard to your obligations, and that all takes place in advance of the actual review, which happened in Geneva. And so at the review, then the committee asks questions of the U.S. government delegation on specific topics, all sorts of different topics. And so what we were trying to do, and I'll just say this, throughout all of this is all really done by a large group of people from around the country. And we sort of were the figurehead people who got to do a lot of the fun stuff, but a lot of the work was done by people all over the place. So what we were trying to do is trying to get the committee, basically lobbying the committee members to get interested in our issue and ask questions of the U.S. government about our issue. And so that's what, in advance of actually going to Geneva, this coalition, we made a lot of drafts of sort of one-pagers that we could hand out to committee members explaining the issue, because these are people who may not, don't know anything about what's happening in the U.S., don't know anything about migrant farm workers, may not know much about U.S. law. And so we drafted one pagers that we'd hand out. Um, and I can't remember if it was for the ICCPR or for the UPR, possibly both. We created and I say we, I had very little input in this, created 5-minute videos that sort of also, told the story of why this was important, talked to people who um, had firsthand experience or their clients had firsthand experience being threatened, being run off farms, being arrested, with good video and photographs, sort of really showing and bringing it home to the committee members what the situation is. Um, and so a lot of that was done by, I think, law students at Penn, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Legal Services South Carolina, I think, Legal Aid of North Carolina did a lot of that. And so when I actually went over to Geneva to do this really uncomfortable lobbying of these people, um, it's um it was hard because I didn't know what I was doing. And no, it seemed like almost nobody knew what they were doing. But trying to just sort of walking up to the committee members as they're walking down the hall or interrupting their lunch and trying to talk to them about this issue and giving them the one pager. And if they had any interest at all, showing them the video, um, and sort of advocating that they ask the US government these specific questions and make these specific recommendations. Um, and we didn't get any questions. I don't think we got in the report. I can't remember. It was in the UP. I think it was in the UPR report. We got a sort of a recommendation about improving access to justice generally for H-2A guest workers. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. It was a lot of fun. Um, um, and then I won't go into the detail about the UPR. I also got to go for the UPR process where the UPR happens before the Human Rights Council, and those people on the council are actually employed by governments, and so it's much more political. And so I remember just trying to reach out to every delegation that I thought might be interested. I really thought the delegation from Haiti might ask a question because we had a lot of Haitians on the Eastern Shore working. And somebody told me, you can probably get Venezuela to ask your question, but what's the point? Because the U.S. will not care what Venezuela says. And eventually I tried to get Venezuela to ask a question and they wouldn't ask it either. So um, part of this was, I think, throughout this process, the big issue was the war on the US's global war on terror and Obama's drone strikes. And so that sucked up a lot of the oxygen for other issues. And that may always be that way. There's probably always one big issue that most of the countries are interested in going after the US on. Um, anyway, so, we continued, TRLA at least continued to, and with this coalition, continued afterwards to use human rights mechanisms or try to use human rights mechanisms on behalf of farm workers, and which is not to suggest that people didn't do this before we did. I know people at TRLA at least had done some of this kind of work before. Jennifer Harbury, for example, I think had used the Inter-American Commission repeatedly before. But as late as 2020, I think Amal, who was at Southern Migrant Legal Services, our project in Nashville, um, did a report or a submission to the Inter-American Commission on Farm Workers and COVID. I know Legal Aid of North Carolina has continued to do some work on this. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else to say. I think, for this particular issue, I'm not sure that the actual international work in Geneva did much of anything. Um, Maybe it did. I think it was interesting to educate people from around the country about this issue, and so maybe that will pay dividends in the future. Um, it led to us having a meeting at the end of the Obama administration with sort of some coalition members and people at U.S. Department of Labor. And we thought we were, maybe that was going to go somewhere, and then the administration ended, and it wasn't going to go anywhere once Trump came into office. Um, but this issue has, I think before we started this work with the coalition, I think Rena said this was sort of people were handling this, state by state basis, because it is kind of a creature of state law of whether you can have access to people on employer provided housing. And since then, I think it's become more. The coalition has stayed together. There's still a working group that they meet, I think, monthly about migrant camp access around the country. So I think it has been helpful in some regard.
Thank you, Nate. So I want to definitely open up for questions. So raise your hand or put a question in the chat. We've reached the end of our lecturing to you time. So time for questions. But I do, and I'll start with a question while everyone thinks of their questions. But I do agree. I think human rights work, just like social justice work around the country, right, is a long-term project. Like you might make one step forward and then it's two steps back. And the international advocacy is the same way, right? You have to sort of take an issue and keep arguing like every review for dozens of years, and before you get the question or you get the statement from the committee and its report that you want. And so I it's just, and I think that it's like hard to lose. It's hard to lose sight of like that all of it is making. It's like the needle is going a tiny bit to your way, but like even if there's no big dramatic success that you can point to. But I'm wondering, for you two in particular, maybe like, and maybe this is a really personal, but like what impact did this have on your career, on your way of thinking about things, your way of approaching cases? What was there any impact? Did it make you, were you happy when you were doing it? Like, what? Because I think that's an important professional identity question too. You can think about that one. Maybe that's too personal.
I mean, for me, it definitely has been a through line through my career. As I mentioned, even starting in undergrad, I was very interested in human rights work. And then when I was in the Peace Corps, I was actually, telling people about their human rights. Studied it in grad school. So it's just something that has been of interest to me, and that's how I look at the law. And this really allowed me. The story for me is like, I was looking after I graduated from law school, I was looking for an organization to do human rights work, legal human rights work but in this country. And you can't believe how hard it was to find that, because really everything was focused on overseas. Like you do human rights work, but you do it in another country. And I was looking to do it here. And so I identified legal aid as a place that does human rights work, but just doesn't say it. And so it was really odd for me that then I got the opportunity to really do that work at legal aid. It just solidified that, the work that we are all doing in the public interest, to get people representation, to get people access. You all may be familiar that the Sustainable Development Goals, this last time around, I mean, they're now a decade old or something, but the last time after the Millennium Development Goals added a goal 16, and it was an access to justice goal. And there's an understanding that, you can't have the rest of human rights, you can't achieve those things without access to justice, without this right to access counsel, without that rule of law undergirding. And so the fact that access to justice was added as a sustainable development goal. I think it underpins human rights. And I approach my work as the head of the Access to Justice Commission, always looking to how I can reframe an issue in human rights terms, even if I'm not like using, using the law, I'm always using the frame and the language, and my understanding is sort of guided by that. So that's how it's affected me in my career.
I I guess it affected me in that it sort of opened up, or opened my eyes to other possibilities, other ways of helping out, helping people. Um, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. On a personal level, I really enjoyed it. I miss it a little bit. So yeah.
I love it. Okay, we have one question, and I'm gonna let you talk. There you go. You should be able to ask your question.
Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment, if I may.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you so much for organizing this webinar, and thank you for all the great work that all three of you are doing. I am actually a staff attorney at Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I do a little bit of IP work, intellectual property work, but I also do a lot of human rights work, both at EFF and also at this nonprofit organization, Human Rights Advocates. I'm actually currently the president of the board. And as part of my work under Human Rights Advocates, we collaborate with different clinic students to research different topics so that we can do advocacy work at the UN. And we have been doing this for 30 plus years. And also as part of EFF, we do a lot of human rights work that is related with technology. So I would love to connect with you all, and especially under Human Rights Advocates, we are currently looking for different projects to collaborate with other organizations and do some kind of advocacy work at the UN. So if there is any opportunity for us to collaborate with you, I would love that. And I just sent a LinkedIn request to Rena and you, Lauren. So I if you have the capacity, I would like to reach out to you and have a conversation and see how we can collaborate.
That's wonderful. Yes. Love it. I'll also put my email in the chat. Anyone who can keep my email if you have questions or want to connect. Would be happy to do that. And yeah, thank you. Thank you. That sounds like amazing work you're doing. Um, Okay, we're reached our time, so I'm gonna let Rena and Nate go and stop the webinar. But I really appreciate everyone who's joined again. We recorded this, and I'll post the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar in the Google Drive. But thank you again, Rena and Nate. It was wonderful to have you, and thank you all for attending. And there will be more of these soon. So. Thanks so much to everyone.